Platformer franchises come and go over the years, with some being the most recognizable characters in gaming. For years for the genre, you cannot get as high as iconicness as Mario or Sonic, but during the 90s and early 2000s, there was one more that was able to reach their heights. And that character so happens to be Crash Bandicoot. Now this series was well known in the gaming sphere as one of the very first 3D platformers that was made, and it was dubbed the PlayStation's unofficial mascot at the time. Not only that, but it was also created by Sony's most iconic game studio, which so happens to be Naughty Dog, who eventually worked on other acclaimed games over the years such as Jak and Daxter, Uncharted, and The Last of Us. But it was Crash Bandicoot that essentially started their PlayStation career. Now with the first game during development, it had a lot of tough difficulties along the way. And the reason why is mostly because of the owners of Crash Bandicoot at the time, and no, it was not Sony, as they never owned the series in the first place. Instead, they were just the publisher. So instead, the owners were Universal Interactive, a subsidiary from Universal Studios. It was there Naughty Dog was able to make a deal with Universal and Sony to make a platform for the PlayStation codenamed the Sonic's Ass Game. Yeah, I could not read that with a straight face. The reason why they called it that is because Sonic was the most iconic animal mascot at the time, and they were pretty much doing something similar with Sonic. Which is basically taking a really niche animal species and trying to make him a memorable mascot, which eventually became a Bandicoot. However, there were big difficulties along the way when it comes to Universal, as they wanted to tamper the game multiple times because they wanted Crash Bandicoot, for example, to be called Willy the Wombat, which Naughty Dog outright refused to the point where they threatened to cancel the project entirely. And the most egregious thing that they tried to do was take all the credit for the game by not even trying to credit Naughty Dog at all. Which happened during E3 when they were showcasing the game where they had none of the logos at all. But Naughty Dog is not going to let that slide, so outside of the facility at E3, they had flyers going out crediting themselves as the creators of Crash Bandicoot. They even sent a flyer to the head of Universal Interactive for a review, which as you expect, the CEO was not happy about it. Which really emphasized the fact on how back in the day, Crash was owned by a shady company, but luckily these days, he's owned by a shadier company. As my personal history of the games, I grew up with the second and third one, but never played the first one until the Sane Trilogy. But I'll talk about those in later videos, but with everything out of the way, let's get started. So the story starts during a sinister night at the highest point of a castle of Wumpo Islands, which is the home of the evil Dr. Neo Periwinkle Cortex and his partner Embryo. These two are mad scientists who are planning to take over the world by mutating the local wildlife and hypnotizing them to do their bidding. And so, while they were inventing the furries, they also created Crash Bandicoot, which Cortex is aiming to make him the general of his army. But once they try to use the Vortex Cortex to control Crash, it then fails and then let Crash loose where he was able to escape. But he ends up leaving his girlfriend Tana behind. And so it's up to Crash to travel across different islands to save his girlfriend and to stop the evil Cortex. The story of this game is by definition a platformer story. A lady's in trouble, you need to go save her. Which is honestly fine. Similar to Mario, stories in the Crash game is not really high on the priority list. Or should I just say, like, more in-depth story, because there is a bit of a story in the Crash series, but I'll talk about that later. Cortex as a villain is pretty intimidating for the first game, but he's pretty much essentially a basic mad scientist villain, but he gets a lot more interesting in future games. And as for Crash himself, well, I really adore this character. I always have a soft spot for solid protagonists, and while Crash doesn't speak, his personality is well known thanks to his expressions alone. And as for the gameplay, well, it's pretty much a straightforward side-scrolling platform, but now in the third dimension. I pretty much say a side-scroller because even though that we're walking through a 3D platforming area, you're still going down a side-scrolling-like level. Crash can run, jump, and use his iconic spin attack to platform his way through the tons of levels. Crash's controls in this game is very basic for the most part. I do not know how to explain this, but his jumping is a bit on the weird side, because he somehow feels both heavy and floaty at the same time. It's very weird. And while the controls are very basic, the level design themselves is pretty damn challenging. as this game can be pretty damn hard for the most part, especially when you go near Castle Cortex. What makes Crash very challenging is that when you start a level, for example, you have nothing to defend yourself, so when Crash gets hit, it's a one-hit kill. The only way for Crash to get health in this game is to help by this magical mask called Aku Aku. The only way to find him is to find his face on these specially marked boxes. And if you're able to find 3 Akus, you're able to go invincibility for a brief moment with this catchy-ass tune. We're able to kill pretty much all the enemies and destroy as much boxes as you can. And I've got to say, destroying as much boxes as you can is probably the most fun I have in the game. And I think it's mostly due to the sound effects in this game because it just has this very crunchy feel to it. Just be careful with the TNT crates because they will blow you up. And also look every nook and cranny in this game because destroying all the boxes is pretty integral of completion, and there's nothing as more as infuriating as missing one box in the game. As for every level in this game, there's a special box gem you can get at the end of every level, with some of them being color gems that can give you alternate paths. And this is when the most dated aspect of this game comes in, because one of the only ways to save this game is that you need to get the box gem. Yes, going for 100% is required to at least save the game, as the only other way to save this game is to find the bonus areas, which is found by collecting 3 tokens of either your girlfriend's or Embryo's face. But going back to the box gem, getting all the boxes in the game could be doable, but it gets even much more difficult considering the fact that you need to go through the entire level without dying once. Which is extra infuriating considering the fact that certain levels goes a lot longer than others. But on the plus side, there's a lot of different variety of types of levels you can go throughout the game. The first area has you traveling across the jungle and climbing across this village. But there's also some levels that shake things up, like the iconic boulder chasing levels, where Crash runs away from a giant boulder, which is a bit of a hassle because you can't see too much of what's ahead of you. But for the most part, these are pretty fun. And the other kind of gimmicky levels you can find in this game are also the ammo running levels, which is something that the Crash series is known to do. And as for the first game, we have Crash questionably winking in front of the camera before riding the giant hog across the village. These levels are also pretty fun, although the controls are a bit of a stiff side, but honestly it kinda does make sense considering Crash is literally hijacking the hog. These creatures even come back for their revenge during the bridge levels where they try to kill Crash off the bridge. Man, remember back when Crash got resurgence in 2017 and people were constantly complaining about the bridge levels? And honestly, looking back, these levels aren't really that hard. Especially with some of the bosses in this game because the difficulty of the bosses varies drastically. Like for example, the very first one you have here is Papu Papu. Oh my god. He's a joke. Which is very astonishing compared to the other bosses because with Ripperoo, the difficulty here is honestly just right. Because all you have to do is have the TNTs blow up near him. And Koala Kong is also another good challenge because all you have to do is just dodge the TNTs and boulders while using the boulders themselves to attack him. And then we head to Pinstripe, who is probably the second easiest boss in the game, which is honestly saying something because he has a f***ing Tommy Kong with him. And next we have Embryo, who is honestly my favorite boss in the game, as he uses his mutagenic potions against you, and eventually when his health goes way down, he then drinks some and grows gigantic. And lastly, Cortex is a pretty good final boss for the game, as he uses different colored projectiles to go against you, and you have to reflect green ones to attack him. But if you collected all the gems, you can go through the Great Hall to save Tana immediately, pretty much bypassing the final boss, with the ending screens telling these funny little stories on what the villains have been doing in the meantime. 100% endings has been a staple for various Crash games, but this is the only time where the secret ending is the non-canon one. And I'll be honest, I think I prefer the regular ending compared to the secret one because they have a bit of a satisfaction with defeating Cortex, as Crash claims victory across this giant blimp, riding across a beautiful looking sunset. And that leads to the presentation of the game because even though this is an early PS1 title, I honestly say it holds up surprisingly really well for PS1 standards. One of the main things that is well known for Crash Bandicoot is pushing the limits of the PS1. And the environments to this very day is very impressive, and I think that's all had to do with how everything feels very alive. especially with the cartoonish aesthetic this game is going for. And as for the music, well, I honestly say it's pretty good, but I wouldn't say it's as memorable as later Crash games. Don't get me wrong, there's still tunes I really like, especially with Insanity Beach and such, but sometimes I feel like some of the music can be a bit too much on the ambient side. But it's still really good music, don't get me wrong. And that's what I can say about Crash Bandicoot throughout, because while I do have a lot of respect for this game, I'd say this is the most dated one out of the entire Crash trilogy. I'd honestly say if you're very curious on the series, play the sequels before this one. But that's not the fault of the first game, because this was the very first Crash game, so there's a lot of growing pains of making a first entry in the series. But if you're very curious of playing Crash 1, then I highly recommend trying out the Sane Trilogy, which has the definitive version of playing Crash 1. Ah yes, Crash Bandicoot the Insane Trilogy, a collection of 3 remakes of Crash's most acclaimed games, and out of all the games in this collection, Crash 1 had the most major improvements that makes this way better than the original. For one, the controls of this game feels a lot better than the original, as it feels very much more snappy. 100%ing this game is a lot easier now because you can die as much times as you like and still get the box gem. With the only exception being the color gems, because with these, you still have to go through the entire stage without dying. And another thing too is that after playing this and this back-to-back, I've gotta say, I am very amazed how well they were able to reimagine some of these cutscenes from the PS1 days in the modern time. Especially since this released about 21 years apart, and it honestly really shows how far we've gone with game graphics. And the best part of this game is that they even added brand new content to this PS1 title, like the time trials that was introduced to Crash 3 for example. You're able to play as Coco Bandicoot in some levels, and she's a character that doesn't debut until the second game. I'll talk a little bit more about the character in the next one. But the biggest selling point of this level is bringing back a cut level from the older games called Stormy Ascent. Now this is basically a harder version of Slippery Climb, a already really hard level, which is one of the levels that requires the colored gems, and if you mention that, is that even with the remake, you still have to go through the entirety without dying. And Stormy Ascent is pretty much that, but way harder. And it was the entire reason why this level was cut in the first place because of its difficulty. So, which honestly makes it one hell of a time to complete this level. So while I am a bit hesitant on recommending the original PS1 version, I highly recommend the Insane Trilogy version. It pretty much fixes a lot of the issues of the original, and pretty much refines it to today's standards, while adding plenty of new content as well. But things get better for Crash from here, because for the next time we enter the Crash series, we then head to Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back, one of my favorite games of all time. But for now, we're gonna head to the Kanto region for a bit, to see where Pokemon got its footing. And after that, we'll then head to a certain little purple dragon. But that'll do for today, so thank you for watching and I'll see you later. Bye bye!